So let me now introduce the panel and, most importantly, our panelists. So the West has really come up throughout the conference, whether on the economy or on culture or politics. And without wanting to preempt the discussions in any way, I think it is clear to many, if not all, that the West is in a very, very deep crisis. And it's not just any crisis, it is something potentially existential. You know, what's our self-understanding? And if we don't have a good self-understanding of what makes the West, the various cultures that make up Western civilization, including faith traditions, including civic republicanism and much else besides, and how can we possibly have a meaningful engagement between civilizations? You know, if we're told to decolonize our curriculum, including maths, which I've never quite understood how that works, but maybe someone can enlighten me, then how can we possibly have a proper understanding of other civilizations if we don't even know who we are ourselves? So I think that question of the West is one which I think runs through the conference, but I'm so pleased we now have this panel, and I want to introduce our very distinguished speakers. The first is Tom Holland, who needs no introduction, but nevertheless, I shall say that he is one of Britain's best-known eminent historians, best-selling author, most recently of Dominion and Pax, but also, of course, has a wonderful podcast called The Rest is History. And if you do follow him on Twitter, as I hope you do, and if you don't, then please do. There are some wonderful, wonderful photos and stories, and you can really get a sense of how lively that history telling is. So we're extremely pleased to have him, and also huge thanks after another trip, most recently, I think it was to Leipzig and Württemberg. He has come up on the train, so Tom, it's wonderful to have you here. Tom will be followed by Sebastian Milbank, who is, besides being the executive editor of The Critic and a prolific journalist, also the author of one or two books, I think both still in the making, but they are excellent. And I can say this because I read one of them as a PhD, and it was a superb PhD that I was very pleased to be able to examine. And Sebastian is, of course, also one of the co-organizers of this conference. After Sebastian, we'll have David Pan, who is the editor of the journal Telos. And if you haven't picked up a copy of the journal, I really, really would urge you to do so. There's still some copies left out at the table. And David is also a professor of German at the University of California at Irvine. A very regular translator and contributor to Telos, of course. And then finally, we are going to have a paper by Lola Salem, but she can't be here with us, which is why Susannah, who needs no introduction because she's already been introduced, Susannah has very kindly agreed to read Lola's paper. And then what we'll do is we relay back questions and comments to Lola. As I said, Lola really, really is very sorry she can't be here, but she is stuck in France. That is very unfortunate, but we'll have the paper. Now, without any further ado, Tom, please.
Thanks so much for that introduction. It's very nice of you to applaud me, but I'm not sure that I merit it because I have to make a double apology. I am doubly unqualified to talk right now. The first is because, as Susannah will vouch, basically it's been months of me yowling and howling. I don't know what post-liberalism is. So coming to address a conference on post-liberalism, I feel nervous. And then I felt even more nervous when I was coming up on the train and Susannah sent me a text saying, I'm going to be reading this paper. And I went, paper? And I had not read Adrian's email where he said that we had to give a paper. So I'm having to completely extemporize. So many, many apologies for that. And the lesson when you're a student and you go in and you get a terrible exam question that you haven't prepared for is to attack the question. So this is going to be my this is going to be my policy in what I'm briefly going to say now, which is, what's the title of the thing? Renewing the West. Renewing the West. So renewing, I mean, is this a command? Is it a description? Is it a question? I don't know, and I'm looking forward to finding out. But the other thing I thought I'd focus in, and again, apologies if there has been, I'm sure there must have been previous discussions of this, but I will add my thoughts on it for what they're worth, is what do we mean by the West? So I grew up in the Cold War, and to me the West was basically countries in NATO, members of the G7, kind of basically capitalists who were against communists. But that clearly, the Cold War has gone, but the use of the West continues. And there's a kind of I think people have a hazy sense of what they mean by it, but it can be difficult to absolutely nail it down. So I always thought one of the most interesting definitions of what the West is that I came across was in a book by Rémi Brague, who I think Susannah was going to be here, and sadly can't, the great French historian of philosophy and religion. And he defined the West as countries that are in the West are countries whose citizens are very interested in the civilization of the pre-Christian Roman Empire. And if you think about that meme that went round last year of American women talking to American men about whether they thought about the Roman Empire and being stunned that American men were apparently thinking about the Roman Empire all the time. I mean, that shows that the United States is a part of the West. And, of course, in Europe, people have been interested in the culture of pre-Christian, the pre-Christian Roman Empire, basically for as long as there's been a post-Roman world. People have probably been reading Virgil every day since he wrote the Aeneid. People have been studying Cicero. People have looked back to the biographies of the Roman emperors. The great biography of Charlemagne by Einhard in the 9th century was modelled on the life of Augustus by Suetonius. And I think that this level of interest, as I say, in the pre-Christian Roman Empire is distinctive to countries that today we might call the West. It is not an element, say, in Orthodox culture. It's clearly not an element in Muslim culture. The Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, they are heirs of the Roman Empire too, but they're not interested in the pagan culture. So I would say that that is one element of what it is to belong to the West. The other element, of course, is, I think, to be Christian. And the Christian character of the Roman Empire is, by and large, what people in the early Middle Ages were interested in. They were reading the great pagan classics, basically so that they could learn better Latin, thereby to write more effectively on Christian themes. And when people in the Middle Ages look back to the example of the Roman Empire, it was to the Christian Roman Empire that they looked. And I think that that, of course, is something that is common with the Greek world, with the Byzantine world, with the Orthodox world today. And I know you've been hearing from Orthodox speakers like Paul Kingsnorth. But I think that, again, what would define the West is the fact that it is the heir of a specific manifestation of Christianity, that what you might call Latin Christendom, a Christendom that articulates its thoughts, its attempt to understand the world in Latin. And it is a particularly distinctive form of that I think emerges after the age of Charlemagne, after the Carolingian period, in the 11th century, when, for complicated reasons that I don't have time to go into, a radically new understanding of Christendom emerges that defines itself as reformatio, a remaking of the entire world. And at the core of this profoundly radical understanding of what a society should be lies the conviction that just as an individual sinner can be born again, can be baptized into a better understanding of God and the good life, so too can an entire society. And this is the process of reformatio that comes to be steered by the papacy, by the Roman Church, which effectively is the first great revolutionary institution in what I guess you could safely call Western history. And it establishes a template of this notion that a good society is a society that can cleanse and purify itself, can make itself better. And it establishes the civilization of Latin Christendom in the High Middle Ages. It is Europe's first revolutionary society. And that tends to be obscured because for so many subsequent revolutionaries, the civilization, the civilization of Latin Christendom in the Middle Ages, in a way, is the archetype of everything it's rejecting. It's kind of superstitious. It's a Middle Age. It's something that has to be repudiated and scorned. But I think that the manifestation of that in subsequent convulsions in Western history is a very kind of Oedipal display. It's a repudiation of the paternal convulsion that the Papal Revolution, the Gregorian Revolution in the 11th century instituted. And of course, the word reformatio, anglicized to Reformation, the Reformation of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, that is another manifestation of this. And I would say that the convulsions in the 18th century are as well. But of course, what happens in the 18th century with the movement known as the Enlightenment, very modestly, this is deeply rooted in Christian assumptions and impulses. It is an attempt to cleanse and purify and make better, not just specifically Christendom, but the whole world. In that sense, it's much more totalizing. But I would say that the universalism of the Enlightenment derives much more evidently from Christian universalism than it does, say, from Virgilian universalism. The universalism of the Enlightenment casts itself as something that is not distinctive, not specific to Europe or what we might call the West, but cosmopolitan and universal. And it establishes a kind of template for successive movements, successive attempts to reconstruct and reconfigure the world that has followed on from the 18th century. So the French Revolution, of course, is the great modern example of that. And very tellingly, it kind of fuses Roman, the inheritance of pagan Rome. French revolutionaries are always comparing themselves to the ancient Romans. Christianity, the idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and that a great reckoning will be brought down on those who are unjust, and particularly the rich. And of course, the universalism of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution in classic French style, can't decide whether its focus is France itself or whether what is happening in France is properly for the good of the whole world. And then the Russian Revolution, there's no place for pagan Rome in the Russian Revolution. There is a lot of Christianity in that, and there is a lot of Enlightenment universalism in that. And then perhaps the most radical movement of all, fascism, and its most kind of its darkest manifestation in Nazism, there is no Christianity in that, I would say, or very little. Perhaps the idea of the 1,000-year Reich, but not much else. Whereas there is quite a lot that is Roman. There is quite a lot of harking back to the pre-Christian world. And so that is by way of saying that I would say that the sense that the West is in crisis and therefore needs to be renewed, I mean, there is nothing more Western than that. There is nothing more Western than that. That is the motivation that powered the fascists, the communists, the French revolutionaries, the philosophes, the reformers in the 16th century, and the extraordinary foundational reform movement in the 11th century. And so whatever form, I guess, the West emerges into, and I do think that we are going through one of these kind of periodic convulsions, one of these periodic reconfigurations of the past that transmutes traditions that are very venerable, but they are recast in a kind of radically new form. Whatever it is, I mean, I think it is still Western. I think that impulse to renew itself is, in a way, the definition of what it is to be West. And so I look forward to finding out what form of Western renewal this current manifestation is going to take. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'm incredibly honoured to be following Tom Holland. Without aging Tom at all too much, I did grow up reading his books, and in fact, it's what I'm so sorry. That's the worst thing I could have said. But no, but in all sincerity, my fascination with Rome, I think, began with a book called Rubicon, and Tom's done a wonderful job of framing the question for us, and specifically the question of what is the West. And I will try and focus a little bit more on why it might be in crisis and need renewal. But I'll just say a word or two about that, which is, I think this difficulty of defining the West, and we had some very interesting definitions there, is partly also something inherent to the West. So the West, if it's defined as rooted in the civilization of Greek and Rome, that's a civilization that's travelled as far east as Afghanistan and beyond. It's a civilization that's gone beyond the Western Ocean to new continents. And in a sense, the West is, there's a wonderful description of the West amongst German Catholic historians of the 19th and 20th century as the Abendland, the evening land. And I think if you imagine the West as a kind of flickering twilight boundary, always on the point of destruction, always looking towards apocalypse and eschaton, but always struggling for that last sort of Tolkienian fight, that last moment of renewal, we will get a sense of almost the eternal vitality of this self-renewing civilization. And I think I was also very provoked by this idea of continual renewal. Not, I would say, revolution, and we can touch on that later, but the idea that you see so strongly in the work of Christopher Dawson, of this idea of these perpetual kind of monastic movements of renewal. There's always, that Benedictine monastery has been corrupted. We've got to found a new order, and I think that process is so fascinating. And I call it non-revolutionary because it doesn't destroy what comes before it. And I would also say that the original Christian revolution did not destroy Rome, but carried forwards the best elements of its civil philosophy and theology into Christianity. So I'll just try and go quickly through my prepared remarks so I don't take too long, and address this question of why the West might need renewal. So the question I want to ask is, are prosperity and growth, health and wealth, freedom and pleasure, the birthrights of every Western man and woman? This was the assumption, drilled into me in schools in England and America, omnipresent in commentary and culture, that I, and every other child of my generation, was unthinkingly inducted into. If those things are not happening, something has gone wrong. Indeed, if you believe in the creed of perpetual progress, error is not enough. Malice must be involved. It is this instinct, far more than any wave of traditionalism or class resentment, that I believe is really driving populism. Since 2008, the birthright of the liberal West has been successively betrayed. Growth has slowed, and the proceeds of that growth have been concentrated amongst a rent-seeking class of capitalists and asset owners. Western capitalism has gone from an industrial, productive economy with a heavily unionized workforce to a virtual, financialized, and service-based economy, and one that heavily benefits the wealthy and has decimated the professional pride of both middle and working classes. In the old dispensation, America had been moving towards some end-of-history hegemony, and Europe was on its way to a luxurious retirement home, the playground and museum of the world. Far from resenting this reality, many exulted in it, pointing to the safety, happiness, and long life enjoyed within the cradle of postmodern, post-Christian Europe. But American power has come at an ever more dystopian cost to its own citizens, who share in all of its costs, but fewer of its benefits. Meanwhile, in Europe, the final civilizational holiday away from reality has been rudely interrupted by millions of migrants arriving on the beach and the decay and crisis of the vast welfare states that maintained our once comfortable retirement. Faced with the global migration crisis, most Westerners simply don't have the conceptual tools to formulate a response. They lack a language even to frame the problem. The vast masses of people who are meant to pamper Europe and its dotage, doing our dirty work and flattering our conscience, have quickly become insuperable challenges to our way of life. On the one hand, they strain the trust and resources of our public services, and on the other, they challenge the very liberal values which enable their arrival. This isn't in the script, any more than catastrophic climate change, economic stagnation, and illiberal challenges to American hegemony were in the script. Faced with the unthinkable and the unsayable, we in the West attempt a variety of strategies. Like the flagellants of medieval Europe, who during the Black Death sought their redemption through self-mortification. It is not liberalism that has failed us, it is we who have failed liberalism. Whether it's the paint-throwing armies of Just Stop Oil or the legions of Black Lives Matter protesters, there are those who say we no longer deserve our hedonistic birthright and must earn it back by paying reparations to the oppressed or refraining from such sinful activities as eating meat and sexual reproduction. Others, romantics and reactionaries, but for the 1990s, think we can simply turn back the clock. We can return to the days of irreverent free speech absolutism, the early days of vice, the infinite economic potential of unregulated technology. If only we deregulated the planning system, withdrew from the ECHR, and closed down liberal arts colleges, wokeness would be banished, the blob defeated, and Margaret Thatcher would return astride a white charger. A third group yet recognises the contradictions of the liberal project, but simply wishes to throw in with the authoritarians of the world. The perspectives shade from illiberal democracy to full-scale fascism and everything in between, but there are no nuances here. There are just people making a virtue of the collapse of every liberal good and promise. Our confrontation with the end of automatic progress and an encounter with the material and conceptual limits of freedom has brought about, I think for us, a kind of spiritual crisis. What makes this crisis insoluble is that almost everyone looks to a material solution, whether this is the hardening of borders, the return of growth, or the redistribution of wealth. Yet the sources of all our material woes has a spiritual origin. Our crisis can be summed up very easily. We cannot answer the question, who are we? People, communities, and cultures that can answer this question can answer every other. How should we live? How should we die? How should we marry? How should we love, and who should we love? What do we teach our children? Who is our friend and who is our rival? Who belongs? What must one do to belong? What do we owe to one another, and to whom do we owe it? We cannot resolve any of these questions because we cannot answer that first and most basic question. Modern liberalism evacuates any possibility of an answer. Its only answer to this and every other question is, who am I to say? Or, worse, and with its most coercive inflection, who are you to say? All that leaves us is with the liberal birthright, a worship of material freedom and comfort. Those who have inherited that assumption are being forced to confront an older reality. There is no guarantee that life will get better, that all will be well, and that the West and its way of life will improve or even survive. The greatest threat to the West is not economic injustice, climate change, or demographic change. It is an identity crisis. We've ceased to be people able to endure suffering, engage in collective endeavour, or show reverence to the sacred. We have forgotten that our present prosperity, stability, and freedom was built on generations of terrible effort and sacrifice, and we have lost the capacity to think intergenerationally, showing contempt for our ancestors and indifference to our descendants. The refusal of the chains of identity and obligation that this history places upon us is as one with the refusal of our duties to one another. Absent material abundance, the dream of liberation has fast become the nightmare of social atomization. Westerners are facing the return of the gods of the copybook headings, but absent the social bonds that help them survive and adapt in past eras. How do we get out of the crisis? How do we turn things around? I'll repeat it again. we must know who we are. The question of identity is neither, as commonly assumed, individualistic nor ideological. The claim that our religious and cultural patrimony is something we can determine or choose is an illusion, as I think Tom Holland has demonstrated. Our real Western birthright, the one that is truly inescapable, are the words, deeds, and ideas of Shakespeare and Dante, Napoleon and Charlemagne, Augustine and Aristotle. Whether we like or dislike, agree or disagree, the history is ours. It is who we are. When we know who we are, we can begin public life in earnest. Problems are not solved, but they become tractable. In the economic, social, and political spheres, relationships based on shared loves, rather than shared process, become possible. The West must reconcile liberty and duty, love and order, and pursue, as Augustine said, an order of love, an ordo amoris. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference. It's really been fantastic. Adrian and John and Sebastian and Jen working for us here. It really has been a pleasure. I really enjoy hanging out with British people. You're so clever and humorous all the time. It's a pleasure. So anyway, thank you very much for the audience as well. I hope this little presentation will interest you. So it's about the opposite of West, the changing opposites of West. So if the trajectory of Western civilization since the Renaissance has been toward a gradually increasing secularization, this movement has reached a definitive end. The liberalism that has best embodied the spirit of secularization has reached a crisis that can only lead to either the end or the radical transformation of liberalism as the basis of Western political order. The roots of the crisis do not lie in political or military developments, though, but in an internal crisis of identity within those areas of the world that have been most closely related to the idea of Western civilization. As Tom Holland noted, those most linked to pre-Christian Rome, the United States, and I think of the NATO countries as well. While the events of the 21st century have made the crisis apparent, this identity crisis is not a recent or passing phenomenon, but has in fact been going on for over a century. That is, since the beginning of the 20th century, with the cultural malaise that preceded World War I. If that war unleashed a more open political development of the crisis that has since overturned the Western-dominated world order, it could only do so because of the internal contradictions of that order. For us to understand the possible future development of Western civilization, it will be necessary then to first outline the precise parameters of the crisis of liberalism. As a basis for political theory, liberalism arose out of the attempt to establish a theory of natural law that could be deduced from rational principles that are independent of cultural constraints. This project first defined Western civilization as something that could be considered qualitatively different from other cultures. If the Latin Church was at one time the primary definer of the West in opposition to both Islam and the Eastern Church, in a way that set one set of theological traditions against another, such an opposition was a continuation of a fundamental mode of human cultural differentiation. But this theological basis for Western identity began to become less relevant with the Enlightenment. It was at this point that modernization began to define the specific difference of the West as opposed to the entire rest of the world, which was to be understood as either primitive or barbarian. The key distinguishing factor became technological modernization in the end, leading to superiority in economic and military capabilities. The focus on technological progress as the basis of Western superiority led culturally to a move away from theological standpoints as a basis for ordering the world and toward a seemingly more rational system of order based on natural law. The idea of natural law created a system to accommodate the conflicting political and cultural orders within Europe, while at the same time maintaining a fundamental, unbridgeable distance between Europe and the rest of the world. Carl Schmitt describes this period from the Peace of Westphalia to World War I as the Jus Publicum Europaeum, in which wars within Europe were limited by exporting the most horrific violence elsewhere. This division of the world was legitimated theoretically by natural law theories in which the New World was equated with a state of nature. The establishment of the West as a civilizational project, then, was on the one hand an affirmation of the fundamental legal distinction between European soil and the colonies, and on the other hand a suppression of theological perspectives from legal and political decision-making. To the extent that the idea of natural law is built upon these two conceptual moves, the end of colonialism has brought with it a return of theological perspectives as the explicit basis of politics. That is, as the disintegration of the Jus Publicum Europaeum eroded the idea of a fundamental difference between the West and the rest of the world in terms of the applicability of norms of international law, the legitimacy of natural law also declined as a rational system to be opposed to the irrationality of non-Western cultures on the one hand and theological perspectives on the other. The current return of theology and politics has led to the delegitimation of the liberal project of a worldwide unity based on the rationality of a rule of law that might gradually replace both theology as a basis for conflict and war as a means of resolving conflicts. The return of political theology leads then to a fundamental questioning of the natural law basis of liberal political theory and practice. The key points of critique are the way in which natural law begins first with the individual as the basic unit of analysis, and second with the idea of self-preservation as the fundamental goal of a universal law. The philosophical basis of those critiques is that, as 20th century philosophical anthropology has indicated, humans are fundamentally social beings and must be considered as such for political theory, and that moreover they are constitutionally dependent upon an overarching order to maintain meaning for their lives in a way that would go beyond the principle of individual self-preservation. There are three consequences of these developments for the future of the West and liberalism, all of which point to the privileging of the authority of popular traditions as opposed to rational ordering by a managerial elite. First, on the philosophical level, or on the political level, philosophically based systems in the style of Kant and Rawls will give way to nation-state sovereignty and political theology as the basis of morality and justice. The nation-state can no longer be constrained to fit within the model of a rationally constructed liberal democracy. Instead, it will be recognized as the primary locus of cultural difference and popular sovereignty. Secondly, the cultural consequence is that each nation-state constitutes the public sphere within which a particular tradition can develop. Cultural traditions will regain primacy as the basis for the political theology that defines political identity of in each nation-state. Culture will no longer be considered as the development of a global liberal cultural elite defined by institutions such as the Nobel Prize and a unified film industry. Thirdly, markets will gain importance not as the expression of individual autonomy, but as a powerful tool for harnessing individual creativity for collective goals. Markets are one of the most powerful ways of shifting decision-making power from administrative elites to local actors, and we need to organize as much of economic life around markets as possible. That said, markets cannot be treated as a principle, but as a tool. This means that the state must establish the rules for markets that will channel individual and decentralized innovation and creativity in such a way that the result will be the proliferation of possible solutions to the key problems for our economic and environmental existence. Here we must think of ways to bring capitalism, that is, capital itself, to the people. The most straightforward way to do this, I think, would be to eliminate the entire welfare state and use this money to create a universal basic income. This would convert a system that treats people as clients receiving services into a system that empowers people as agents by giving each person a rent that constitutes an asset that is capital, thereby allowing individuals to make whatever choices they want about how to employ this capital to create a meaningful life. A post-liberal future will focus first on popular traditions rather than liberal reason as the basis of political sovereignty, and second on individual agency within markets constructed around collective goals as the basis of economic life. Thank you.
remember, I'm Lola. And she said that she was stuck between France and Germany, which I don't totally understand. It's just, I find it concerning, frankly, but anyway. Yeah. I'm sad not to be present in person to partake of this remarkable assembly of minds. My heartfelt thanks go to the organizers, Adrian and Susannah especially, for graciously agreeing to read these remarks on my behalf. As the conference nears its conclusion, we find ourselves inching ever closer to the crux of the matter. I'm delighted that the stellar lineup of speakers is about to resolve the question of renewing the West once and for all, finally putting the matter to bed, as it were. Great ideas are a splendid thing, and those that are true even better. But ideas are embodied things rooted in the real world, and reality has a knack for breaking the mold of ideology. In the domain of arts, I often see people endlessly toying with grand concepts, people determined to project the future of the arts as if it could be neatly conformed to some off-the-shelf ideological blueprint. Sometimes the problem is very subtle. For example, it's now a trope that many online dissidents call for more beauty into this world. Unable to define it and oblivious to the sheer breadth of artistic creation happening, they decry postmodern art as revoltingly ugly. Yet renewing the West requires a plan beyond slogans like beauty matters. What do we mean by this in the most concrete possible terms? We've already had our fair share of neoclassical revivals. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good neoclassical building or a well-crafted piece of chamber music as much as the next person. There will always be a place for this, and that's a good thing. But art, whether sacred or secular, is rarely stationary. Even nostalgic trends need a push towards the unknown, something to propel them beyond the lukewarm reheating of what feels merely nice or comfortable. Otherwise, they risk becoming little more than a pretty facade of a wider cultural malaise. As mass culture becomes ever more superficial, it substitutes the fetish for historical detail for a profundity of which it is no longer even aware. This is a poor trade, one that leaves us at risk of mistaking artwork for a collection of Poundbury towns. So let's be honest. When we say that we want to renew the West, what do we really want? Politics, Andrew Breitbart memorably proclaimed, is downstream from culture. Or as John Maynard Keynes put it rather less pithily, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Both the gadfly of the alt-right and the economic guru of the old left recognize that the political and economic are more often than not rooted in assumptions which were once novel and contested. Just like faith, culture defines and connects us while conserving a shared way of life. This definition requires elite cultural production, thriving for excellence, and aims to create communal references. By this, I mean practices and beliefs that inform our sense of identity and social interactions. Economics do have an impact on the arts. They set up clear material constraints that frame artists' creativity. Today, however, tastemakers erupt their decrees with an ideological strength that breaks down former traditional relationships between tradesmen and craftsmen, commissioners and artists. On the left, cultural power is delegated to experts in academia and the creative industries, gatekeepers of the Overton window. They seek to shape the assumptions of those who wield power and determine how resources are allocated. Under this rule, culture is governed by identity politics, EDI, gender questioning, decolonization of curricula, erosion of borders and boundaries. This, now largely accepted as valid and integrated in most institutions, undermines capitalism, attacks the idea of private property, seeks a greater role for the state, circumscribes freedom of conscience, sets back educational excellence, and contributes to secular decline. But on the right, what's happening? People don't know how to solve this issue because they fail to understand what powerful men and women do with their wealth. The wealthier people are, the more they enjoy their wealth, be it in buying houses, racehorses, yachts, or art. All these are good, valuable things, and there is much art to buy, from the visual to the patronage offered by music or any of a dozen different forms. Yet the recipients of this largesse judge them rather than their wealthy patrons judging them. In practice, this means that conservatives progressively lose their people, not least their elite donor class, to the tastes of others. The progressive illiberal stronghold over the intellectual and corporate world on these matters is so predominant that art patronage offers no space for dissent. Rather, it captures the money of conservative donors while betraying their beliefs. No one wants to look a fool or bore in the company of a cultural elite. However, increasingly there is no way for many on the right to stand their ground, since they struggle to have one. Some, uninterested in the arts, dissociate themselves with its knowledge, its economy of taste, and therefore its artists. Others who like arts don't understand how its mechanics have been captured and what it takes to move forward, thus delegating the task to others, and the circle completes itself. Claiming that beauty is good is not enough, I'm afraid. If we want to prevent cultural decline and win the debate, our winners need to do something with their winnings. Our elites need a plan. Otherwise, we surrender too much high ground to people who use it mercilessly, relentlessly, and yes, intelligently. Because our society is still that of the written word, literature is often an easier point of access to talk about the arts. But all arts differ, and all need, collectively and independently, a well-crafted infrastructure that will allow them to flourish. They all have specific modes of production, expression, and education with unique needs. This isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. Most, if not all of you, have been through university. That's why the debate around culture and the renewal of the West is so febrile around higher education. But who's been in a conservatoire for 5 years or more, or in a visual arts school, or even a craftsman's workshop? Are you truly confident that you understand their structural problems as well as you do that of the university? Saying beauty matters doesn't fix anything on its own. It says nothing about how art materializes and what artists need. More importantly, it says little about what beauty looks or feels like. It's a prescription without a medicine. If we think that politics cannot or should not remain neutral about culture, then it's time that we discuss the economic forces underpinning the arts as much as the lofty ideas behind them. It's not all doom and gloom. There are a few incredibly potent projects and intelligent people up to the challenge. The Create Streets Foundation, led by Nicholas Boyce Smith, is one of them. But these efforts need cultivation and structural support, and it cannot be that of central government. As the welfare state killed the welfare society, the cultural state devours the arts. The alternatives, however, don't need us to reinvent the wheel. Some might argue that monasteries can do the trick. I'd suggest private salons are a more pragmatic option. The renewal of the West isn't just an abstract idea. It's the delineation of a space where creativity, dialogue, and tradition converge. From there, we might rise, courageously and humbly, against the forces of civilizational decline.
Thank you very, very much indeed to all for... Thank you. Thank you very much indeed to all four speakers. I think we've had some fantastic presentations, as we have had throughout the conference. Now, let me open up immediately to our wonderful audience so you get a chance to ask a question or make a comment. Let me take the gentleman right in the middle, followed by Luke at the back, and also the gentleman here in the white, not quite white shirt, but you know, near enough.
Right, thank you very much. So, fascinating panel, wonderful suggestions, and I want to just ask a question pertaining to the spectre of the authoritarian solution, which is sometimes proposed by other people who call themselves post-liberals. And I take it that one of their concerns is the thought that liberalism, the regime we live under, is not neutral, and that there's deep disagreement about values, about virtue, and about the values and virtues that would underpin any renewal. So if we think about virtues, for example, there are clearly many that are deeply controversial. For instance, the notion of temperance, or if we were to look at the capital virtues, the notion of chastity, a virtue that is, of course, widely rejected by many people in contemporary society. So how does a non-authoritarian, post-liberal renewal walk the line of being sufficiently specific and concrete about the virtues that are to underpin renewal, without shading into what will look to others, to some, like the authoritarian imposition of a sectarian view of virtue?
And because we are personalists, please do mention your name when you ask a question. So could you just remind
Jacob
your name?
Williams, writing a PhD on post-liberalism at Oxford.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. behind you.
Luke Bretherton. Just first of all, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Susannah. Really, and all those involved in the conference. Really wonderful set of panels. So this is an invitation to further reflection for all the panelists, and I'll be it's born out of an explicitly Christian concern about how the story of the West and Christianity is narrated. There's one version of the story where it's a kind of secularizing story, which I imagine most people here have kind of want to leave behind, where the story of the West is a kind of growing up and a leaving behind of Christianity. That's a kind of old Western Enlightenment kind of story. There's a story you tell, Tom, of where you can't really get to a story of rationality in science and universities and human rights without the Christianity, that's not incidental, that's central to the formation of how we understand the West. There's another version of telling that story in the kind of Oswald Spengler version, going back to the kind of early 20th century, late 19th century, where this term Abendland, he takes up this term Abendland that you raised, Sebastian, in a slightly darker way. And in that version of the story, Christianity is not a kind of spiritual force of renewal. It's the kind of mechanism by which you get to essentially a kind of white supremacist, rationalist frame of reference, but against the secularizing version of the story, you need Christianity, and so you have to recover Christianity as a cultural project. And it's that version of the story, and this is the existential bit for me, which is being renewed and taken up again in people like AFD and Rassemblement National, Swedish Democrats, but taken up, unlike, interestingly, Spengler, in a way that's anti-ecclesial, anti-clerical, and frankly, Christophobic. And that's got a lot of legs in Europe today as a way of accounting for the relationship between Christianity and the West, which I think is a real threat to Christianity and it's as a spiritual force, and it's very seductive for lots of people because it's seen to defend family, faith and flag in ways that I think are very reactionary and authoritarian in import. And then I think there's other ways we might understand that relationship in constructive ways. And that's kind of my question. It's a real struggle. How does one tell that story in a way that doesn't feed into what the likes of AFD and Rassemblement National and others are doing? How do you tell that story, and how do you tell it in a way that navigates this line, I think, between either a secularizing version or this kind of authoritarian, to warrant certain kind of authoritarian projects?
William Gunson. I grew up in New Zealand, and I was just thinking in some of the definitions of the West, we've had, perhaps dare I say, because this is partly an American-led discussion in some respects, a lot of discussion about governments and in particular certain forms of government as effective. But what occurs to me is that across the West, particularly the English-speaking components of it, what we actually all share among quite a few of those countries is a head of state, namely a king at the moment. And I just wondered, in terms of governments, obviously the monarchy sits conceptually separately from a government, but I wonder, it has enormous convening power. It has certainly a moral background, and dare I say a moral power, at least in certain parts of it, where, because it's a Christian institution, it has ceremonial power and so on. And rather than perhaps focus on the purely, if you like, the effective parts of constitutional government, I wonder if the more ceremonial parts of it might also have something to offer this discussion in terms of renewing the West, either historically or currently.
Thank you very much for those three excellent questions. Who on the panel would want to respond to which? Let me maybe go in the same order. Tom, do you want to?
Why did we reverse?
Reverse the order. Very good. In which case, well, we're not going to ask Susannah to pretend to be Lola throughout the Q&A, so I think we're probably going to not going to do that. So David, you go first, and then Sebastian, then
My discussion was a little truncated because I wanted to get through it quickly. One of the aspects of what I see as happening is that that kind of rationalist liberalism, which kind of seemed to be triumphant at the end of the Cold War, really masked a kind of I don't know what you call it, a dichotomy between two ways of understanding just what the victory was in the Cold War. Because on the one hand, there was it was a victory of capitalism over communism, but it was that I think that's the way it was. It was a victory of capitalism over communism, but it was interpreted as a victory of liberalism, right, and liberal democracy. And so, but I think that was a false interpretation, because what happened then was that the United States went on to try and kind of cash in on that victory by pursuing this policy of kind of promoting liberal democracy. I mean, the Iraq fiasco was really, I think, the best example of this, or maybe Afghanistan as well. But in any case, what we've come to now after that, and I think the United States has come to the conclusion that no, exporting liberal, it was not the victory of liberal democracy at the end of the Cold War. What I think it was the victory. It was the victory of Westphalia. In a way in which, the Peace of Westphalia established nation-state sovereignty as the basic unit of international relations, and in that way made way for cultural specificity. So this is, I think, what you're indicating about, this conflict between authoritarianism and I guess specificity. And so what we have with the nation-state system, you have specificity. You can have cultural difference without having constant conflict. And this is what I was talking about in terms of theology, because it was a theological. Obviously Westphalia was a solution to a theological civil war, and so it really created a template for international order that never was really. Didn't have a chance to establish itself because it was bound up with the conquest of America and that whole movement toward, I guess, an understanding of the West as rationalization. And so we've finally gotten to the point, I think, now, where we can return to that Westphalian solution in which it's an issue of competing theologies, but we're able to resolve that by focusing on the nation state as the place of specificity, and which requires a kind of homogeneity in each nation state in terms of the fundamental basis of political identity, but yet allowing for that at the same time as being able, because it's a nation state system, to accept heterogeneity without civil war. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Thank you. I'll try and answer them sort of together as best I can. Just on this question of the Arbentland, as you probably know, Spengler sort of misappropriates it rather. It's originally something from Catholic German historiography that's really trying to challenge the kind of militarist Prussian account, nationalist account of German identity, and it's a very important part of the birth of Christian democracy and of the European project. And on this question of the nation state, I'm going to slightly challenge David. I think that the nation state precisely emerges as a liberal project. Now, that isn't to say there aren't older nations and peoples, but the idea of the heterogeneous plurality of peoples and national claims, I think, becomes an absolute source of conflict in the concept of an absolute sense of state sovereignty, or that kind of political theology in the sense you say. And my feeling about what post-liberalism is trying to do, just in relation to, for example, responding to populism, to the AfD, to all of these forces, is that my fear with populism is that it says it's on the side of ordinary people, but it's so allied to this almost Silicon Valley idea of disruption, this almost revolutionary sense. And the problem with disruption is that it's good for people like the people in Silicon Valley who always profit from everything being torn up because they have the power, they can come in and take it. But it's terrible for ordinary people and people in the middle who are trying to build lives. Ordinary people need stability and they need order. And my feeling, they need certainty that tomorrow is still going to happen. And my fear of a project of and the reason I think we need renewal rather than disruption is that renewal is, I feel like the role of post-liberalism is not to be a wrecker. It's not, because liberalism has failed, it's not the time to come and kick it while it's down. It's not the time to kill it off in the hopes that something better is going to fill its place. It's the time to nor of course is it the time to try and resurrect something that's already dying. It's to come in almost to try and kind of heal and renew and create some new life amidst all of that. So the point is to come in and restore institutions. It's not to destroy them. It's not to say we must have no more universities. It's not to say it's not to sort of throw out democracy, every liberty, every social and material gain in the last 100 years. And I think there are people who are so casual about that. And I want to say, I'm not, and I think we're not.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Tom, would you like to?
So on the question of authoritarianism, I cannot think of any of the major attempts that have been made over the past millennium to reform, remake, purify, improve society that has not depended on a measure of authoritarianism and by extension violence. And that for violence, I said that the two great streams that feed into the identity of the West are the Roman and the Christian. And for the Romans, all change was bad. Res novae, new things, it was terrible. You didn't want it. So therefore, if you had to reform, you always had to pretend that you were going back. You'd look, backwards to the future. And likewise, the Christian mythology introduces the idea of the end of days, when goats and sheep will be sorted out and the New Jerusalem will descend to the earth. And in a sense, all the great reform movements have drawn on those two traditions to greater or lesser extent. So the primal reformatio, the primal attempt to renew the West, saw the institution of the Inquisition, saw crusades, saw the persecution of heretics. And heretics would be people either who were left behind by the reformatio or felt that it hadn't gone far enough. Likewise, in the Reformation, we know what happened in the 17th century. The 30 Years' War, in a way, kind of is the great shadow that hangs over the emergence of liberalism. And the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the fascists, we all know. They were all attempts to remake the world and make it better. They all thought that. Hitler as much as Robespierre and Lenin. And that's why, personally, I find discussion about renewing the West slightly unsettling. I realise I've basically become a kind of Burkean small c conservative. I generally think that attempts to remake society, whether you could be doing it for the best of reasons, people have done, but it usually does spell a measure of authoritarianism, and it usually does spell a measure of violence. On the how to frame the relationship to Christianity, I think it is. I think it has been necessary for what we might describe as modernity, modern liberal democracy, or whatever, and perhaps particularly now in a multicultural democracy, that the role of Christianity has to be veiled, because Christianity is obviously sectarian. You either believe it or you don't, and people who aren't Christians, what should Christianity's relationship be to those who reject Christianity? That's been a problem for Christians right from the beginning of St. Paul. He wanted, there is no Greek or Jew in Christ, but what do you do with Jews who don't want to be part of a kind of internationalist mush? You do that. So I think that the genius of Western Christianity was the fact that as it was its assumptions were exported around the world, it disguised the fact of what it was. It kind of framed it as somehow universal, secular, post-religious, where of course they were no such thing. But that has been very necessary to the effective functioning of a multicultural society like Britain or France or whatever. But that is also why there are so many fracture points about what the secular should be, what the liberal should be. The fact that secularism or liberalism are not politically neutral is something that their successful functioning basically has to be disguised and veiled. So I think essentially the role of Christianity in the emergence of these values has to be veiled, and I guess if you're a secular liberal, it serves as a kind of noble lie. And on monarchy, I mean, sure, monarchy has been a feature of Christian societies, and indeed, of course, imperial rank has been a feature of Christian societies. Christendom has been far more comfortable with the idea of monarchy than, say, Islam has been. But at the same time, one of the most obvious way, I guess, in recent history in which that Roman inheritance has manifested itself has been with a sense that the overthrow of monarchy can provide a renewal, that a republic is, in a way to renew the West, if you want to do that. That's true of the American revolutionaries. It's true of the French revolutionaries. I think now that the kind of the inspiration of Rome specifically is dead. I think Mussolini and Hitler between them killed off any idea that we would ever want to emulate Rome again. But I think the muscle memory of that remains. The idea that republican virtue is perhaps something to aspire to. But obviously views on that will vary on whether you live in a benign constitutional monarchy or whether you live in a republic that's just elected Donald Trump.
Right, thank you very much to all panelists. I'm going to take another round of questions. Michael Lynn had his hand up first. Tom Chaco has had a second. And then I'm going to make okay, I see. We're going to take 2 rounds. So let's keep the questions and comments as brief as possible, and also the answers, please, as concise as possible. Michael first.
Yeah, very briefly. After World War II, Theodore von Lauer wrote a book called The Westernization of the World. And so my question is, if to be Western is to have this heritage of Rome and of Christianity, the vast majority of countries in the world today, outside of former English colonies, have civil law. They have Roman law. It was adopted, sometimes with minor modifications, but more or less adopted wholesale in Africa and the Middle East and in much of Asia. If I'm not mistaken, the majority of Christians in the world will, if they're not already outside of Europe, they soon will be in places like Africa and Asia. So they use Roman law. You have billions of Christians, or hundreds of millions. They use kilometers, right, and French revolutionary measures. Even if they're anti-Western, they use Western concepts. They say we're an Islamic republic from res publica, right, from the Roman Republic. And if they're cultural nationalists, if they're Korean cultural artwork, they're inspired by 19th century romantics. In the 1980s, a third of humanity lived under Marxist-Leninist regimes. So whether they were in Africa or Asia or whatever, they had pictures of a German, Marx, and a Russian, Lenin. And in communist Vietnam, the people called them the bearded ones, right? They had these posters of these bearded Europeans. So my question is, and this is where I think the danger is. Now the far right would say, but they're not white, okay? That they're not. They can never be Western, even if they use Roman law and they're Christians and they use kilometers and so on. So the question is to what degree has the world already been Westernized? And so the West, in a sense, has become universal, both through 19th century and 20th century colonialism, but also the adoption of all of these Western institutions by the post-colonial nations.
Thank you, Michael. Tom Chaco in the middle.
Thank you. My question is, aren't we going to face very severe practical difficulties in terms of whether we'd be allowed to renew the West, at least if it has any economic component? David was talking about the aspiration for spreading out capital to the people through a universal basic income. Sebastian talked about the disappearance of the expected promise after 2008 and how we've moved on to what seems like a stagnating rentier system. And we heard from Michael Gove a series of very practical steps that will be used to undermine that. A land tax, moves against foreign landlordism, moves against private equity buyouts. But if this was ever to become practical, they would fight back like crazy. BlackRock and Vanguard were not going to roll over. And this is not such a problem for the US, but in the UK, the West isn't really owned by the West. So I don't know how many of the wealth funds of Gulf monarchies care whether or not the housing arrangements of London are contributing to human flourishing. So this seems to be a feature standing behind some of this I think we haven't really thought about, which is if any of this ever got taken seriously, we would get a lot more trouble.
Thank you, Tom. Gentleman here in the fourth row.
I said with the beard.
That's right, with the white beard, not the grey one.
That's very
Just
good. Very good.
To be absolutely precise.
First part of the question is for David Pan, and it's the issue you were talking about how, if I have you right, with the decline of colonialism, theology re-emerges. I would have thought with the decline of colonies that the secular liberal thrust in the West reached its highest point. The second question is, when we're talking about nations in this conference, I have a sense that people think we can go back to just being isolated, non-interacting entities. I don't think that's possible. I speak from a small nation myself. I know it's not possible for us, and we certainly don't want to go back to certain parts of our history. So I'll leave it at that and just.
Thank you. So, relatively brief responses. We're going to go in the original order. So I'm going to start with Tom this time.
So on the issue of Westernization, I think that Western hegemony was the most globe-spanning that history had known. I mean, clearly it's Europeans who discover the world is round and who settle the world and colonize it. And I would guess that there has never been as global an influence as the West exercised in its period of imperial hegemony. And whether you want to characterize that as the spreading of a perfume across all corners of the globe, or perhaps radioactive dust, I won't go into that. But what I would say is that, and this touches on the second point, is that economic power and cultural power are obviously very closely interlinked, and they always have been. And the converse is that as economic power collapses, so cultural power collapses and retreats. And we're clearly in a period of massive retreat for Western influence, and therefore cultural, philosophical, whatever, the influence and the prestige of the West is in retreat. And I think you can see that very clearly in various countries around the world where there is an attempt to try and go back to a kind of it's decolonization, but I mean it's a very radical form of decolonization, which is to interrogate the very words and concepts that actually had motivated and inspired often the people who initially had attempted to throw off colonialism. And I guess India would be the classic example of this, that the fathers of independence are, so Nehru or whoever, I mean these are all kind of Fabians. They take for granted, they speak English as their main language. English is a language saturated in deeply Western Christian concepts, of which I guess secular would be a classic example. They establish India as a secular republic. Both of those, one is a very Christian word, one is a very Roman word. And it means that, I guess a bit like cricket, it lingers on after independence, and it becomes something that people in India feel is part of their own cultural patrimony. But I think that what you see with Modi's government, the kind of the eulogizing of Hindutva, of the idea of a kind of, it's not getting back. It's an attempt to get back past the idea that there is something called Hinduism, which is a religion which exists separately from a secular society, which is something that the British exported to India and was very influential. And I think the attempt by Modi to reverse that, to repudiate it, to try and get back, and Islam as well. Islam also is characterized as a kind of alien intrusion. Get back. I mean, in one sense, it's a kind of mad scheme, but it is the kind of mad scheme that traditionally you have always seen in world history, where revolutionaries, by and large, cast their revolutionary activity as something very conservative. And I think, for instance, you also see that going on in Turkey at the moment with Erdogan. The fact that Hagia Sophia was enshrined by Ataturk, consciously inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, to frame Hagia Sophia not as a cathedral, not as a mosque, but as a museum, as a place that could be studied. And Erdogan has repudiated that and reinstalled Hagia Sophia as a mosque. I mean, that is emblematic of a process that is going on in the world of Islam at the moment. Again, an attempt to kind of go back to a period before Napoleon landed in Egypt and started the process of kind of Western contamination, I guess, that lots of people, Islamic reformers would typify it as. So I think that's absolutely part of what's going on. And obviously that has a knock-on effect on the West, because the more powerful non-Western countries become, so the boot starts to come on the other foot, and so the West comes to find itself, whether economically and perhaps in the long run culturally, subordinate in the way that previously other countries were to the West. Karma, I guess, would be, some might describe it.
Thank you, Tom. Sebastian, do you want to react to perhaps not all of the questions, perhaps one, and then we'll get David to answer the question that was specifically put in.
Yeah. I'll just address Michael's question then. This is not the West, nor are we out of it. And I'll just explain quickly what I mean. I think we're in an age of fundamentalisms. That can be Hindu, that can be Christian, that can be Islamic, Jewish, and I believe liberal. And I think I don't see this denial of Christian legacy in the benign terms as a noble lie. I'm afraid it's a very ignoble lie. And I think it is so because I actually believe it has become a form of fundamentalism. Rather than being inclusive, it is a simplification and reification of history, as fundamental as the contemporary Salafi refusal of the great Islamic philosophical traditions, as the Hindu refusal of the great and often benign influence of Islam and traditions between Islam and Hinduism. All of that incredible legacy of the Mughals denied. And it's just the same as what we're doing here in the West. It is the same the world over. And if we are all in the same problem, there are also perhaps we might all have a shared solution. Eric Voegelin says that every culture, in a sense, is universal. And I think it's not just the West that's universalizing culture. It's the one that's dominant, but that does not mean that other cultures are not just as universal in their own self-understanding. And I believe the way that we should see culture, instead of these impersonal fundamentalist hegemonies which must destroy each other and triumph in a Darwinian struggle of cultures, we should instead think of interlocking spheres. We are each within each other's spheres. There is a place that ought to be a place within Christianity for Islam, for Hinduism, for Judaism. We're not going to see each other the same way. And there should be a place for us within those cultures. And that is the point. When we make a home within our cultures, within our civilizations, within our hearts, for other traditions, it's not a question of liberal relativization. It is about finding deep kinships, points of real connection. And I think if we can open the door, and I think this renewal, not as a revolution, but as a renaissance, we can open the door to our own culture, that opens the door, I think, for other cultures to reclaim their own patrimonies. And so my vision of post-liberalism is one in which different cultures and religions are all able to engage in a kind of shared project of renaissance. And that's how I see it.
Thank you, Sebastian. David, the question that was put to you, and as brief as we can for that, and the last three questions I will take in just a minute. There were a couple of hands up already. Anyway, go ahead, David.
I think Tom Holland kind of partly answered the question about colonialism, because I think really the end of colonialism has really meant the reassertion of all these different cultural traditions, and that whether you like it or not, whether you like the sort of return to Hinduism or the affirmation of Islam perhaps in other countries, it's not a secularization. It really is a return of theological notions, and that seems to be the upshot of the end of colonialism in terms of the way individual I'm going to go back to nation states, really understand themselves, and that and I do see that as the best way to handle this, rather than Sebastian mentioned this idea of trying to create this I don't know, unity or I don't know, correspondences across cultures. I just don't see that's so realistic. I think it's more realistic to see the Westphalian solution as the solution for today, not as a liberal solution, but really as one that emphasizes cultural particularity within an acceptance of difference across nation states that doesn't have to be conflictual. And the way to avoid that conflict is to abjure that universalism.
Great, thank you. Very briefly, 3 final points. There was a gentleman here, Wolfgang Streeck and Gabe, and that will be it. Really brief questions or comments, 30-second answers, and then we'll wrap up. So, the gentleman here in the front, first of all, then Wolfgang, then Gabriel.
Hello there. Quick question, Sebastian. I'm intrigued by your idea about economic disruption, and by that, do you mean a slight skepticism towards unrelenting economic growth? Because the reason I ask that question in terms of the dichotomy between growth and stagnation is what's to stop Britain or the West or whatever having a China and the Yangtze situation where you have Panama going down the Thames?
Thank you. Wolfgang?
Thank you very much. When I hear about the peculiarity or of Christianity, I may have been raised in the wrong kind of Christianity, but the concept of sin, repentance, and forgiveness comes up all the time when I think about it. I don't think any other religion has this idea of a constitutive difference between me and God, or between me and what I would want to be and what I should be, and my lack of capacity to live up to this. Now, if that is the case, then loving myself as a Christian is a very complicated operation. It has to go through a number of sort of crushing experiences that tell me that I must love myself in spite of the fact that I am a sinner. And in order to do that, I have to go through very complicated rituals that may do the job of reconciling me with God, or they may not. Why am I saying this? Now, the question is, where is the self-confidence of a Christian civilization coming from if at the same time we're facing this fundamental theological problem of our distance to God? Now, in that sense, for example, if today in the Western societies, the post-colonials sort of show up in our lecture rooms, and they tell us that this society is corrupt in the roots, it's at the bottom, because it is based on the sin of slavery and colonialism. Then how do we deal with this? And where do we get the self-confidence that nevertheless we can tell ourselves that through repentance we can be reconciled with not just ourselves but with God, and with the confidence that the way we live and the way we see the world is something that can be a model for others?
Thank you very much. And Gabriel, please.
So if politics is downstream from culture, as I can now recall Seb Gorka of Breitbart.com himself telling me nearly 10 years ago over a meal, why is it, and as we often hear still talked about, why is it that no one ever says what culture is downstream from? And is it not downstream from the regime, as the Straussians tell us, and David in particular, I wonder if you think today that, as Thomas Powers argues, that we have in the United States an anti-discrimination regime, as Jesse Merriam at Claremont Institute has argued, an anti-racist constitution. And if we hope to renew culture in universities, among other places, haven't we got to deal with things like Title VII, Title IX, a whole set of laws that define what you get in trouble for and what you can get fired for, and whose identities are protected? And isn't that really what's driving the culture, the regime?
Right, we'll go in reverse order once more. So we start with David, then Sebastian, then Tom, and I will wrap up in a minute or so after that.
So I actually think that the cultural and the political kind of simultaneously establish each other, in a sense. Not that one is somehow downstream of the other, but that the establishment of a political order is an identical moment with the establishment of a cultural understanding of what that order is. And I think you're right to a certain extent about what's going on in the United States with the sort of this anti-racism ideology, you would have to call it, I feel like, right now. But that, I think we're past the fever of that, in a sense, almost, right? And that I'm hoping that we're reestablishing a notion of American culture that does focus on some of the more traditional values of the Constitution, and that's really where we're headed, and we'll see what happens.
Just to answer the question that was directed to me very quickly. The problem with growth is not growth in itself, it's the dependence on growth to do anything. So I'll put it another way. The problem is, if people aren't paid in that kind of society, they don't work. Now you might say, well, of course people don't work if they're not paid, but here's the problem. If there's some problem with the money system, as there was in the Great Depression, you have entire communities of people who won't work. They won't build bridges, they won't build roads, everything will decay. And it's because something has gone wrong with an abstract system 1,000 miles away. And that is how you get the cascade effect of social failure from economic crisis. And it's why we're so addicted to growth. Not because economic growth is bad, but because it's a number in a building somewhere far away. Real-term growth, real economic prosperity is something that's built and has to be built in human relationships. You need money, you need a commercial system, but you also need other kinds of labor organization. You need other kinds of forms of social cooperation and collective effort and endeavor. And I think it's the dangerous narrowing of everything to the economic creates an incredibly brittle society, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that.
Tom.
Just to pick up on the last two questions, and I say this in the full consciousness that there's some very distinguished theologians in the room. Theology, I think, has been pretty irrelevant for decades, maybe centuries, in its ability directly to impact society. I think the last great theological innovation was the anxiety on the part of many theologians with the idea of original sin. I think the widespread abolition of the idea of original sin has had a massive impact. But I think by and large, theology manifests itself in the modern West, and definitely since the 60s, which I would see as being a period of cultural change of an order comparable to the 1520s. That in the 1520s, obviously theology mattered hugely, scripture mattered hugely, understanding of how churches functioned mattered hugely. None of that matters in the 60s. That's kind of the whole point. But all that stuff has been transmuted into a vibe. The answer is blowing on the wind. You hear the Spirit in that sense. And that's basically why everything's gone so odd, I think, is that all this stuff is still there. Kind of it's like breathing in asbestos or something. It's in your lungs. You may not see it, but it's still there. But because the kind of the theological frameworks, the scripture, the church practice that gave birth to it is now gone, and nobody knows anything about it, or even they're not even aware that it existed in many cases. It means that we're being influenced by stuff in ways that we don't properly understand. So in answer to your question, what is downriver? So culture is downstream from history, I would say. That is what is influencing culture. Because you grow up in a particular society, you are shaped by it. And you are tempted by growing up in a particular society to mistake your culturally conditioned assumptions and ideals and dreams as somehow being universal, as somehow being human. And to a degree they might be, but I think far more likely they are very, very culturally conditioned. And that is where culture comes from, and that is where politics comes from, I think.
Right, well, before I thank the panel, just very briefly, a few final thanks, really. And before I thank everyone, I also wanted to just say that I think the last 2 days have really shown that while the word or the concept of post-liberalism is certainly contested and also imperfect, because perhaps it does pay too much honor to liberalism, nevertheless, I think there's very clearly now a sense that we live in a post-liberal era, because liberalism certainly is not as hegemonic as it was after the end of the Cold War, and also it really has not got the answers to even conceptualize where we are. So that liberal hubris, I think, that we have all witnessed in the last 30 years has come to an end, and the question is what will, over time, shape the alternatives. And I think the space is really there for us to develop that work, which is why we will be publishing material in the journal, in an essay collection as well, and we really hope that all of our wonderful speakers will send us a written version. We can help because we'll have a transcript, so you don't have to start from scratch, but we'll be in touch about that. There's a lot of work, of course, to be done. But because we, I think, post-liberals really value place, I want to start my thanks by thanking the people of Corpus, where we have been hosted here in the Macrum Lecture Theatre. Because we're personalists, I want to thank all of the wonderful speakers and moderators who've helped us with the panels and with their ideas and their wonderful contributions. I want to thank again our amazing audience who have, again, been here for 2 whole days, given up so much of their time and have made a really exceptional contribution. And I want to thank, because we believe in ethical economy, all the people who have been generous in their support, the Telos-Paul Institute, and Mark, and I don't know where Mark is, but he is around. Oh, there he is, wonderful. Jen, of course, who's been working tirelessly behind the scenes. David, who edits the journal. I want to thank Derek Webb again, our wonderful supporter. I also want to thank the Plough. And last but not least, I want to thank the wonderful panelists. I think it's been a great end to 2 days, so please join me in thanking our panelists.